following seminar has been put together to ensure that users of ReactX's HAVwear technology can use it to its best purpose in terms of managing exposure to hand-arm vibration risk. The seminar will begin by giving a brief overview of the HAVwear technology before moving into some real-life examples of how clients have used the ReactX data to successfully improve their management of hand-arm vibration exposure risk. So before going to the examples, some background information that is relevant to your considerations. In 2005, the UK released regulations for the control of vibration at work, requiring employers to manage the risk for their employees. Despite the regulations being in place now for some 15 years, there continues to be just under 1,000 cases of reportable incidents of hand-arm vibration syndrome on an annual basis. So why might it be that the regulation has not been effective in eliminating this problem? One area of concern is that the vibration magnitude information that's used for people to assess the potential risk to their employees may not actually be appropriate in terms of assessing the risk that they are carrying out in their daily work. In other ways, the approach to risk assessments could be inappropriate in terms of how they reflect the future work of individuals, and if they do not reflect the work of the individuals, then it becomes more difficult to put in place controls which are adequate or effective in managing their risk. One of the major variables in hand-arm vibration exposure risk is how competent an operator is at carrying out the work that they are being asked to do. And being able to assess an operator's competency in the use of power tools may be something that is difficult for someone to establish. It is probably well understood that tool selection, the condition of the tools and the condition of the consumables used for that tool need to be appropriate in order to minimise hand-arm exposure risk. But that is often done without a knowledge of knowing for sure that the right tool is being used and that the condition of the tool as you would expect. So again, uncertainties that may well be known to be an influence, but uncertainties that are not necessarily, without technology, able to be quantified. Another key feature of how ReactX look on the management of hand-arm vibration exposure is the need to leverage the data that can be gathered. The use of metrics, KPIs, the use of data to inform decisions is something that has been coming to everyday thinking for the last decade or so. Data can inform better decisions, and it is within this seminar the intent to show you just how that data can be used effectively in the pursuit of managing hand-arm vibration exposure. So for this next piece, we'll explain a situation where ReactX were involved in doing a detailed study of a repetitive task. So a duty holder, a leading utilities company, wanted to carry a study in a manner where they could define very clearly the risk involved in what seems like quite a simple task, the excavating of a hole in a hard surface. So to carry out the assessment in an engineered, detailed manner, we controlled the size of area to be excavated. The tool to be used was controlled, and it was the same tool that was being used by all the operators. And then the exercise was measured using multiple technologies. So timer watches were used, ReactX HAVwear was used, and scientific measurement equipment, a Larson-Davis vibration measurement monitor, vibration measurement instrument was used as well to gather as much detail as possible. So a around 14 different operators were used in the exercise. In carrying out the exercise a number of times over, it was established that using the typical time to dig the hole, using the average vibration magnitude to dig the hole, that essentially in total it should take about 280 HSE points to excavate the hole, and therefore if the work could be shared with 2 people, the risk for the task should be about 139 points. And if 3 men could be assigned to the work, then the risk would be below the action value, below 100 points. It should also be noted that during the testing, the duty holder was using a tool where the manufacturer declared its vibration magnitude to be 4.2 meters per second squared. The duty holder, through other testing, had established a figure of 12. During the exercise, the measurement established using the Larson-Davis reference instrument was 10.5 as an average over all of the measurements, and the HAVwear device established a value of 11.8, so an order of magnitude similar to the duty holder's assessment and the Larson-Davis measurements taken during the exercise, but significantly greater than the manufacturer's declared value. So as a work study exercise, it was quite comprehensive in establishing the expected risk for this exercise for any employees deployed doing it in a future basis. However, when you also look at the exercise on a personal basis, and you look at all of the individuals who were involved in the exercise, and the people involved in the exercise were controlled by the typical sort of approach to task sharing. They were asked to share the work within their teams. So as a reminder, the 2 teams may have involved 2 or 3 people. Actually, in one occasion there were 4 people involved. But at all times, the work was asked to be averaged or to be shared amongst the individuals. When we look across the series of excavations for the exercise, and we look at all of the individuals, and for all of the holes that they were involved with, what was their maximum exposure for any one hole. And the range of vibration exposures, when you look at it in an individual level, far exceeded the expectation of ourselves or of the duty holder. So there were individuals who were down close to 50 exposure points, while there was one particular individual who almost reached the exposure limit value in his excavation. In checking the records, he did share the work that he participated in that excavation. He did more of the work than his colleague in doing the excavation, but also he received a particularly high vibration magnitude during his work. And what was seen in the video evidence of the activity was that his technique was such that he was essentially transmitting less energy into the hole, into the surface, and more energy into himself, as a consequence increasing his risk, but also taking longer in the excavation activity because there was less energy being transited into the surface as would be desired. So embedded within all of that exercise was a realization that any particular tool will have a range of vibration magnitude. Now, this was also reported by the HSE laboratories, and some of this information is now relayed within L140 guidance. But the HSE laboratories did an exercise whereby they took 3 different tool types and used those tools for a variety of works, and during these different activities measured the vibration magnitude emitted by the tool. And for all of the tools, there was a distinct range of vibration magnitudes possible from that tool, depending on exactly what that tool was being used for. Now, within this exercise, what the HSE also have shown in their graphic is On the left-hand side, there's a little red mark, meaning the declared emission for that particular tool from the manufacturer. And on the right-hand side, there's the mean of all the tests. So what can be seen from this graphic is that in the case of the impact drill, the declared emission value is perhaps usable in for the purpose of a risk assessment of vibration exposure, but in the case of the other two, it's most certainly not. So the HSE do strongly advise that it is really important when looking at the declared vibration magnitude for any tool that the work is done to check how that measurement was taken and if that measurement condition reflects your future use of the tool. Indeed, for any source of vibration magnitude, it's important to understand in establishing that data, how was the measurement taken, what were the tool use conditions, and do those tool use conditions reflect your intended use of the tool? And only if it does, would it then be suitable for use in a risk assessment of exposure to hand-arm vibration. In the L140 guidance from the HSE, they have now expanded from that concept with the graphics to give more detailed information for a list of approximately 30 different tools from different industry types, 6 of which are reproduced here just as an example. So for each tool, they will give a range of vibration values as they have been able to determine from field use of these tools. And they do within the guidance within this Appendix 3 of L140, they would suggest what they would expect a number to be used for a risk assessment. And they use a number which is towards the higher end of that range at the 75th percentile of all the data that they've taken. A few examples here that you might find interesting. Plate compactors, particularly dramatically wide range of vibration magnitudes possible. What that's very much dependent on is whether or not there's been vibration reduction techniques deployed by the tool manufacturer. So for the best tools in this product category where there are vibration reduction mechanisms within the tool, you can see as low as 4 meters per second squared, whereas a typical number where there isn't vibration reduction mechanisms is more like 18 meters per second squared. Another one that you might find interesting here is they do include a stone hammer. A lot of people look on exposure to hand-arm vibration as being something that's solely related to the use of powered tools. But stonemasons in the use of manual tools can be exposed to particularly high levels of vibration magnitude, as indicated here, of between 7 and 22 meters per second squared. And it also should be noted that when using a chisel with such stone hammers, if the chisel is not protected with some sort of vibration reduction sleeving, then the vibration magnitude in the chisel hand will be even higher than that in the hand holding the hammer. So I'll move on now to start to talk about Reactec's technology. So the Reactec HAVwear product, which has been on the market since 2016, is quite unique in that it is able to carry out 2 assessments of exposure to vibration at the same time while any tool is being used. So while the tool is being used, there will be a determination of exposure in the HSE exposure points using the trigger time as established by the presence of vibration, and then using a predetermined, or you might consider an expected vibration magnitude for that tool, and that is information that is recorded within a tool tag attached to the tool. So combining that predetermined vibration magnitude with trigger time gives what Reactec would refer to as TEP points, simply meaning it's the exposure points as calculated by using the tool expected vibration magnitude. And if your tool vibration magnitude is in compliance with HSE guidance, i.e. it should be representative, then your exposure points assessment is in compliance with HSE guidance and certainly compliant to regulations again, providing the vibration magnitude is probably the vibration magnitude experienced by the tool use. So in addition to giving you that assessment of risk, what the HAVwear product is able to do is to give you an assessment of exposure based on a real-time vibration magnitude. By real-time vibration magnitude, what we mean is the HAVwear has triaxial accelerometers in the device that is essentially held on your wrist. And ReactTech have developed algorithms which essentially correct for the transmissibility through the hand to the wrist. So by reversing that transmissibility through the hand, then what we are able to give you is a real-time approximation of the vibration magnitude going into the hand at the time of using the tool. So what we would say is this is a very good approximation of the real-time use of the tool. How good that approximation is will be demonstrated in further on slides. So basically this real-time vibration magnitude together with the same trigger time is used to calculate what ReactTech refer to as the sensed exposure data, or SEP. So the SEP is an indication of real use exposure. Our intention by giving you both sets of data is really to give you the power of seeing where things are different from what you expect. And if it's different from what you expect, that generally means there's a problem that can be solved and therefore a risk that can be reduced. So before going on to explain how well the real-time assessment of HAVwear is in terms of giving you a vibration magnitude, which is probably that experience during tool use, a little bit of information on how the ISO standards would require that vibration magnitude is measured on a tool. So a vibration standard ISO 8041 exists to enable a consistent approach to a precise measurement of a tool's vibration magnitude. It requires that the measurement is taken on each of three axes. It requires that those three axes of measurement are combined in a certain way to give a single value, and requires that a frequency weighting curve is applied to that measurement, essentially to ensure that the vibration signals which are most dangerous are the ones which are most influential on the reading, and all of that is laid out in the standard. Now, to do that in compliance with the standard requires that the accelerometers are firmly attached to the grip point of the tool. It requires some detailed requirements of the instrument. That means that they should be calibrated, and generally requires an experienced technician in order to take those readings and to ensure that the readings are correct. The two graphs shown here illustrate the results from a wide range of tool testing carried out by ReactTech to demonstrate the way in which the HAVwear sensed data is able to correlate with a measurement taken on the tool in compliance to the standards, where both the measurement of the HAVwear and the measurement with the reference instrument, which is compliant to the standard, are taken at exactly the same time. So for each tool, at least 3 tests were carried out, typically of 1 minute duration, and at least 2 people were using the tool to give an average of the people and an average of tests for that tool. If the tools were used for different purposes, those test results are separated, and you can see some tool information, such as this general purpose battery powered drill, being used multiple times. So the HAVwear data is shown in blue, the reference instrument data in green, and where possible on the chart, also the manufacturer's declared data has been included. So for instance, in the case of general purpose battery power tool. The purple line is constant because the manufacturer declares one value, where you could see through the varied use of the tool, both the reference instrument real use data and the HAVwear real use data changing to follow the vibration energy that differs depending on the use of the tool. And I think in all of this data, you would see and recognize a very strong correlation between the ReactTech data from the HAVwear and the reference instrument. There are a few occasions when they don't match, such as this hobby sander. It's an electric power sander. But in the most part, through this large cohort of differing tools, through a wide range of vibration magnitudes, you can see a very strong correlation between the ReactTech data and the reference instrument. By contrast, the manufacturer's data appears quite random as to whether it does match, which it matches on the case of the odd tool, and where it doesn't, where it can be both significantly higher and also significantly lower. So with that background of knowledge of ReactTech's technology and what the data is, the following slides have been put together from real use of ReactTech system by clients over a variety of industries. And from these examples, it is our intention to demonstrate how within the ReactTech data, it is able to identify where an individual's use of the tool looks to be problematic, or where a tool can be identified as carrying greater risk than others, which potentially means it's the wrong tool for the job. And it also allows you to prioritize doing things like tool testing to make sure that you are assessing your risk appropriately. Because at the end of the day, again, if your risk is not appropriate or representative, then your ability to control that risk is equally limited. And lastly, we're going to show you an example of where, in its simplest form, the ReactTech technology has been used as an administrative control. It should be noted that in all of the data being gathered, HAVwear is being used by operators, and therefore these operators are getting information to them which will impact their behaviour. In the vast majority of cases, the operators being displayed information is based on the tool tag, so the assessment based from tag or TEP information, and it's on the basis of that that they adjust their behaviour in terms of whether or not their employer has instructed them to stop working should a certain level of exposure be achieved. So in this first example, we're going to look at where you can identify a high-risk individual. So in each example, we'll start by illustrating how you access the information when logged into the ReactTech analytics platform. So you would log into the analytics by way of the web link and your username and password. If any time the username or password is forgotten, there's a button to click to have that information sent to you. Once logged into the analytics, for this particular example, you access the HAVs drop-down box in the main toolbar, and from the HAVs drop-down box, you're looking for operator average exposure. The operator average exposure report has the following format on the left-hand side of the screen. So you will see a list of employees. In this particular example, we have highlighted one individual. So for that individual, you will see, first of all, the days monitored. So it will be the days monitored in the current period. So the period is set up here as 12 months. So within that current period, this individual has been monitored for 76 days. The period prior to that, he was monitored for 15 days. His average daily exposure within the current period, based on TEP, is 27 points. And based on the sensed real-time exposure, it's 102 points. And this is what brought our attention to this individual as needing some investigation. With a risk level of 27 points, it's obviously low and of no great concern. With a risk of 102 points, the HSE or the ISO regulations would suggest that the individual had a 10% probability of developing HAVs within 12 years. It would also mean that control measures are required and that the individual should be on occupational health screening programme. So however, why is it also so different between TEP and SEP? In terms of how he would be notified on his device, according to the TEP, which was on his display, there was only 3 days in which he exceeded the action value. So for the individual, for the majority of the time, he would have perceived himself to be in a low-risk environment. But the sensed exposure points obviously paints a different picture. So this is the left-hand side of the operator average exposure table. On the right-hand side of that same table, there's this additional information and a blue action button called Total. By pressing Total, you will see a report of all the tools that the individual has used to develop this average exposure. If you press by day, you would see the information on a day-by-day basis. So in pressing Total, you'll see over the period that the individual was monitored, all of the tools that he has used aggregated for the use of each tool, with the tools used most at the top of the list. So during the last 12 months, the individual was monitored for 76 days. In that numbers and vibration magnitude, this is the data that was programmed in the tool tag and is the expected vibration magnitude that the duty holder would expect from the use of that tool. The blue number is the real use vibration magnitude sensed by the HAVwear. And in using the tools in the way that he has over that 76-day period, you'll see the total number of exposure points based on the tag vibration value versus the sense vibration value. Now, by addressing the tools at the top of the list for this individual, as you can see, he's used a number of tools over the 76 days, but by addressing the risk from the tools at the top of the list, then you would be in a position to be addressing his highest risk drivers and therefore most efficiently reducing the risk experienced by that individual. So to identify his use of these particular tools and why perhaps the vibration magnitude may vary, we can look further into the use of the tools by going to the tool menu within the top menus available in the ReactTech Analytics. So under Tools, there is a drop-down menu to Tool Vibration Trends. And within Tool Vibration Trends, you will see the use of that tool over all time. So having dropped down the tool vibration trends, there is a long list of all of the tools available within that particular group or within that particular company. So when trying to search a particular tool used by an individual, the general Microsoft Control F search capability can be used. And then if you enter the tool ID that you are looking for, in this case TID 152, this will be highlighted. And then basically along on the right hand side, by clicking operators, you will see everyone that's used that same tool and what sort of differing information you have across the operators. So having done this in this particular tool and trying to search for our individual that we have been looking for, what we find is that he has been a particularly heavy user of this tool with 11.5 hours, with that high vibration magnitude relative to the tool tag value of 3.3. But you can see a list of all the other people who have used that same tool, some for differing times, but this other particular individual here has used the same tool for a very long usage as well. And what you can see is his vibration magnitude is significantly less than that of Joe Blogg's. and also his vibration magnitude at 3.8 is very similar to what the duty holder would expect for the tool. So this again emphasises a potential issue with an individual as opposed to an individual with the tool. Or, sorry, as opposed to an issue with the tool. So the tool can have a vibration magnitude as expected by the duty holder, but this particular individual who is a high user of that tool has had consistently a particularly high vibration magnitude. So it's very much training that is required for Joe Bloggs in this particular example. I'll move on to a different example now, where we will start by looking for tools that are driving high risk. So this example starts again with the HAVs drop-down menu from the top menu bar. From the HAVs drop-down menu, we're looking for top tool exposure. So having clicked on top tool exposure, you will then see a list of tools, and the vibration magnitude and operators have used those tools over all of the period that you're looking at. So in this instance here, we're covering this particular group over a 12-month period and looking at TEP only data at this point. So you see the total trigger time of use of the tools, their average daily points, and the vibration magnitude information. I can sort this by the total exposure points, and all reports in this manner can be sorted by clicking the column heading. I can also click on the column heading of average daily operator points, which will give you an idea of tools that are used most often, but also tools that are giving high vibration exposure levels almost every time they're used. So in the case of that I'm looking at here, this particular lawnmower, of which there are several model types, is at the top end of the total points for this particular group, but also is at the high end of creating average daily operator points as well. So it means it's a tool that's consistently used and used most days to a high level. I want to look a bit further at that particular tool, so I'll look at the top tool exposure again, but this time I'll click on both TEP and SEP being displayed. It creates a more complex report because there's more information, and it's why it's worth doing, first of all, with only one of either TEP or SEP being looked at. So again, I've sorted it to be able to see that the top tool in terms of total points of exposure is this particular lawnmower. And we're seeing very consistently, well, the duty holder has suggested the vibration magnitude should be 4 meters per second squared. Over all 4 examples, we're seeing a vibration magnitude that is higher than 4 meters per second squared. So this would be an example, since it's used so frequently, where it might be worth doing some tool testing to have confidence that the SEP data is valid, because if it is valid, then the average exposure in using this tool is at a dangerously high level, while the duty holder is believing it's a lower level, and the employees are also being controlled to that level. So this is a tool where HAVwear involved in doing some vibration measurements. So the vibration measurements were using a reference instrument in compliance to ISO 5349 and ISO 8041. What you're seeing in the table here is for the first set of tests, where there were 3 one-minute tests taken on the reference instrument. The HAVwear data was actually only one figure, which is 6.7, versus the reference instrument averaging over the 3 one-minute tests was 5.8. Another set of tests were carried out where the HAVwear was broken into 3 individual measurements. So in this occasion, the reference instrument measured 5.6 and the HAVwear measured 5.6. So you can see it's very, very consistent with the vibration magnitude range as determined by using a reference instrument. And it would certainly indicate that the current tag value that's being used in the TEP data is too low at 4 meters per second squared. Now, if I just go back to the previous slide, you can see that we were recording readings as high as 9, so 7.5 to 9.2 meters per second squared. The HSC would advise that a hand-guided mower could be between 3 and 8 meters per second squared, and it's very much impacted by the force of push and also the type of grass that's being used. The tool testing was carried out on short grass, so it would suggest that the higher readings seen in the previous slide were realistic for long grass cutting. All in all, suggesting the SEP data is very valid, and that the duty holder has work to do here to reduce the risk of their employees. But if they do so, it will have material risk on a large group of employees, because it's such a commonly used tool. In this next example here, we're going to look at prioritizing tool testing over a range of tools. So we're again looking at the top top tool exposure report, but it's for a different group of people, a group of arborists. And again, what we're trying to highlight by looking at the top tool exposure is what are the tools that are used most frequently, and therefore if we can concentrate our efforts on those tools, then we can again hopefully address where we can reduce the risk most materially. So in this example here, there were 4 different types of tool identified from the top 5 in that list. Again, tool testing was carried out to first of all give confidence to the duty holder of the validity of the SEP real use data. Now the 4 tool types that we chose here covered 51% of the risk from the entire data set. If actually we looked at another 3 tools, it would cover 70% of the data set. So again, you can see it's quite easy to identify a small number of tools which will impact greatly the accuracy with which your risk assessments may be carried out. So in all of this data here, the reference instrument is shown in blue, the HAVwear is shown in red, where the duty holder's tag value is in yellow. So in the case of the pole chainsaw here, the 3 values are of the order of magnitude, are of the same order of magnitude, with the sense value from HAVwear being slightly most conservative. In the case of the chainsaw, both chainsaws, the duty holder tag value is under assessing the risk, whereas HAVwear is the right order of magnitude, and it's only actually in the strimmer the HAVwear value is slightly low, but it's not as low as the value that's being used for the duty holder. So in all cases, by relying on SEP, the duty holder would be able to manage the risk of their employees more conservatively than their current view, and in general in the right order of magnitude as compared with a reference instrument taking measurements to ISO 5349. I'm going to move on to a completely different type of example now, and we're looking at the industry of motor vehicle repair, which has been identified by the HSE as a particularly high risk environment. This is some data that was delivered by an HSE inspector who specialised in hand-arm vibration. And of note, the most important statistic is perhaps that in body shop repair, which is one of the highest risk environments within motor vehicle repair, almost 1 in 1,000 people, there is new cases of hand-arm vibration each year. So it accounts for 10% of all reported ridders, despite not being an employment sector that employs the highest number of people. So it is a high-risk sector, according to the HSE. So in the use of Reactex equipment within this sector, we're going to explore some of the data that was found. Following logging into the ReactTech Analytics, the opening view is what we call the dashboard. And the dashboard is intended to give you an overview of performance over a particular period of time. So in this motor vehicle repair environment, we're looking at a data set where the product was used, and that's the timeline that it was filtered for. The pie chart gives you an immediate impression of whether the risk as assessed by the tag exposure versus the real use sensed exposure is of a similar level. And this chart would indicate that the sensed vibration is assessing a risk to be somewhat higher than that from the tag values. In this particular example, the duty holder split their data set between employees employed within a body shop environment versus those within a workshop environment to allow him to assess the risk between the two. And in the league table at the bottom of the dashboard, you can see the performance of the two groups side by side. So essentially what we're seeing here in terms of overall workforce average, for the body shop environment, the risk according to the tag values used by the duty holder is about 40 points per day, and that's similar to the workshop, whereas the sensed vibration value would suggest that the body shop had a materially higher risk than the duty holder expects, but also materially higher risk than the workshop. And if you look at it in terms of the highest individual levels, you can see that there's a very large gap or difference between the highest risk individual and the overall group, which again sort of reflects the sort of information that we're seeing in the utilities example that we showed at the very beginning of this seminar, where one individual materially exceeded the risk of all his colleagues. Again, the data suggests that this is happening in the real environment of this particular company. And again, by the highest risk individual, you would see very much that the body shop is a higher risk environment, and that is reflected in the HSE statistics on RIDDORs. So to try and see what's driving, again, the highest risks, we'll look at, again, first of all, by the operator average exposure. So on the top menu, the HAVs drop-down, operator average exposure, will take us to a view of this nature where you're looking at particular individuals. In this data set, individuals were anonymized with identities, but they were unique. So A13 was a particular individual. So having seen that this individual had a particularly large difference between his TEP and SEP data, by clicking on the total icon to the right, we will see all of the tools used by this particular individual. So the individual, in all his use over the days that he was monitored, the TEP totaled 302 points, whereas SEP was almost 2,500, giving him a daily average of 25 versus 144. And that data was absolutely dominated by one particular tool, an Air Palm Sander, where his vibration magnitude as picked up with the HAVwear was around about 8 meters per second squared versus 3, and that makes a massive difference in terms of its exposure points. And so that particular tool was about 95% of his overall data. So obviously his use of that tool, if that can be addressed, would make a massive difference to that particular individual's risk. So first of all, we want to have a look at whether or not that individual's use of that tool is the issue, or it's the tool itself that is the issue. So to find out about the broader use of that particular tool, again, we'll look at the HAVs menu, and in the drop-down menu under tools, rather, we will look at tool vibration trends. So not the HAVs menu, the tools menu, we'll look at tool vibration trends. So in looking at tool vibration trends, you'll see a list of every tool. Now this report gives you over a 2-year period, so you don't select the tool, the date range, it gives you for 2 years. And again, if you use the Microsoft Control F functionality to search for the tool ID of interest, it results, you find the tool that you're looking for, and you're sure that's the tool that you're looking for. By clicking on operators, you'll see the data from all operators who've used that particular tool. So in this particular example, it was an air palm sander. The operator that we were looking for is A13. You will see that other people have used the same tool, albeit the A13 has used it most of the 3 people that have used that particular tool. But his use of that tool is higher than his colleagues. So the lowest level was achieved by A11, and he achieved a vibration magnitude of around about 5 meters per second squared versus the 8 of A13. Now that is significant. 5 meters per second squared is equivalent to about 50 points per hour, whereas 8 meters per second squared is equivalent to 128 points per hour. So again, even that difference is material. So while the duty holder may have to look at his assumed vibration magnitude for this particular tool, there is also evidence that A13's use of it is riskier than others. So we should be looking at how A13 is using the tool. And in the case of sanders, that could be about pressure and applying excess force, or it can be used. It can be about using inappropriate abrasives or abrasives, using abrasives for too long and not changing them often enough because they're worn. Moving on to another example, and this comes from the world of utilities. In this particular example, we are focusing on tools again. So from the HAV's drop-down box, we are looking at top tool exposure to find out which tools are driving the most exposure for this particular utilities organisation. So having selected sort by top tool exposure, if you sort by total exposure points, you see the tools at the top driving most exposure risk for the data set. In this particular example, a particular tool, the core drill, appeared at the top. So to look at this particular tool more broadly, we sorted by model number. Again, any of the reports, the column headings can be used to change what you sort by. So in sorting by model number, we see together all of the MAG5 codes used across the data set. And I've highlighted 2 particular examples of this code drill where for both, or the reason for selecting them is they are at the extremes of what we're looking at. So one has a very high sense vibration magnitude relative to the TEP data or the tool tag vibration. So one has a very high sense vibration magnitude, and the other one has a vibration magnitude that is more consistent with the sense data. It gives a massive difference to the exposure points, and both have been used for several hours, so it's a reasonably comparable data set. So that's us trying to compare similar models, which are important products in terms of the overall risk of the data set. So to compare these tools in a little bit more detail, again, we'll look at from the HAV's drop-down box, or rather from the tool drop-down box, we're going to look at tool vibration trends. And within tool vibration trends, we're going to sort by model number again to see all of this similar tool together lined up. So we're seeing a very consistent vibration magnitude as programmed in the tool tags. But in the data set here, we're seeing a wide range of vibration magnitudes between all of the tools of this type. So again, highlighting on the 2 that we identified before, where one's at the lower end of the extreme and one's at the higher end, we'll now press the blue operator box to see a little bit more detail on who has used these 2 tool sets. Now what we see here is that consistently between the 2 tools, there are more than one operator using the tools, but there's a consistency in the tool vibration magnitude across operators. So very high in the case of the high tool and very modest in the case of the modest tool. So this would indicate that either the tool itself or the use of the tool by these two different groups are leading to this very different risk levels. And then again, by understanding why, there's an ability to control that risk in a much better way than it has been. So I end this seminar on the best use of ReactTech's smart monitoring technology by taking you to a very different example whereby a civil engineering firm choose to try and manage their exposure of their workforce by the use of an administrative control whereby they reduce the exposure limit value on the alerts and alarms being provided to the tool users from 400 points to 300 points, essentially meaning that as they did their work, they would be alerted earlier in the working day as to when they needed to stop. And that's not to say that in every day they worked to those extremes, but by bringing down that level, it brought down a keener awareness of what is a safe level of work and what is not. So the duty holder had been a user of ReactTech's technology to 2016, but in a very modest way. In 2017, they expanded their use, as shown here by the monitored days, but it was not until 2018 that it was broadly deployed within their workforce, so some 26,500 days of coverage in 2018. And it was at the very beginning of 2019 that they took the action to reduce the limit value from 400 points to 300 points, again, meaning that the operators, while they carried out their work, would be alerted more early to time to stop what they're doing. So as a consequence of this, when you compare 2018 to 2019, from the data that is reported within the ReactTech analytics and its dashboard and other reports, we were able to see that for a very similar amount of data, so 26,500 versus just shy of 25,500 days between the 2 years, a group of employees of 766 in 2018 compared with 690 in 2019. But the number of days where the limit value was exceeded went down from 140 to 123, which was a very significant reduction in percentage from over 0.5% to below 0.5%. But so did the days where the amount of exposure exceeded the action value. That went down from essentially 13.8% of days monitored to only 8.5% of days monitored. And the overall average daily exposure for the workforce had a very material reduction of a third, from 45 to 30 days. And here we see the sort of graphics, again, in terms of average exposure, showing the average exposure down through the days, and showing graphically here 2018 compared to 2019, the distinctly lower level of times when the action value were exceeded. And again, here's some of the detail of where that data was seen. And that's all within the dashboard reporting of the ReactTech analytics. So as I say, a very different example, all based on looking purely at the TEP, as that is the data that is used in the monitors as the operators see while they go about their working day, but simply by making an adjustment to when the individuals were alerted, a marked reduction in the overall workforce exposure levels seen by this organisation. So that brings us to the end of this seminar. Hopefully you will find it useful to have seen some examples of how to identify the operators who have particular use of tools, which indicates that they have issues and that their use of the tool needs to be addressed, whether by training or some other means. Alternatively, by focusing on the tools, how you can see the tools that are driving the greatest risks, which potentially also helps you identify the tools which are maybe the wrong tools being used for that particular activity. And also it can allow you to prioritise tool testing and potentially save costs where tools are tested perhaps unnecessarily. And lastly, an example of where a company has used just a simple administrative control by way of the system to dramatically reduce the overall risk of their organisation.